Hey everybody. I wanted to just throw up a really quick mind map to kind of talk about chapter 6 and kind of get into the details of bone tissue. And then I'm going to do something similar to talk about the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So let's start here in the middle with the skeletal system. As you have already figured out from chapter 1, that we have 11 organ systems, and that the 11 organ systems are each made up of specialized organs, tissues, and cells that come together towards a common goal. So the skeletal system here is primarily made up of things like bones and cartilage and ligaments and tendons. And those things go into the structural format of the skeletal system. But if you start here with bones, you quickly come to realize that bones are actually living tissue. So that means that there are living cells that make stuff, that process stuff, that build stuff, and that our bone tissue can be rebuilt and remodeled over time. So even if you're saying to yourself, I've grown all that I'm going to grow, not necessarily on a cellular or tissue level, you are still growing because you are still breaking down bone tissue and rebuilding it, and you're even remodeling it. Bones are weight bearing tissue. So your bones can become stronger with exercise. That's why if you lift weights, it will strengthen your bones and make you stronger overall. Lifting weights is not going to bulk you up and make you look scary. Lifting weights is extremely important to your bones. If you remove weight, if you remove gravity, your bones become more fragile. That's why when the gentleman came back from outer space, he had such problems reacclimating to the planet. As a matter of fact, I don't think he has reacclimated to being back on Earth because he was in space for so long that his bones lacked the strength that they left Earth with because there's no weight in space. There's no gravity, so therefore there was nothing pressuring down on his tissues. Therefore, his tissues never felt the need to rebuild or remodel, and so his bones were as fragile as a small child even though he was a grown man. Bones allow you to have attachment sites for the muscles. So all those little details that you learn on the bones, those processes, those those the processes, the condyles, all those different areas on bones. A lot of those little details on the bones are actually places where your muscles attach, which is why you have to learn so many of them. And also, it's a storage site. Think of your bones as a bank. They're literally a bank, and they store, instead of storing cash, they store calcium and they store phosphate. So, and you need calcium and phosphate for a number of different things. We'll talk about that as we go along. Now, when we start talking about some of the functions of your bones, we learned that they help with support and protection because your skull protects the soft tissue known as your brain. It also protects things like your eyeballs and other soft tissues. Your ribs help to protect your lungs and your heart. And well, your sternum is protecting mostly your heart, but your ribs help too. Your lungs, your esophagus, all those different soft organs in your thoracic cavity. It helps with hemopoiesis, which is blood cell production. We make red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets all in the bone marrow inside of our bones, specifically the spongy bone. Your bones function as levers to allow us to have movement because your muscles can actually attach to your bones. And when your muscles contract, they pull. And then when they pull the bones that they're attached. And when your bones move, you move just like that. I call this the law of Ludacris. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about the rapper Ludacris. He had a song way back in the day called "When I Move, You Move," just like that. So that's the law of Ludacris. When your muscles contract, they move. When they move, the bones move, and when your bones move, you move, just like that. All right, I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna quiz y'all on that later. And then they also act as storage. They act as banks because they store energy and minerals. Did you know that your bones actually store some adipose tissue in there? Believe it or not, it's actually more so yellow fat, or you know how you have red bone marrow. You actually have yellow bone marrow, and that's stored energy that your bone cells can use. And of course, it stores minerals like calcium and phosphate. Phosphate, you use it as ATP, which is ATP are energy molecules that all of your cells use, while calcium, man, calcium is used for everything. I call calcium the keys of the body. And the reason why is because just like a key, I got a gang of keys in my pocket. Just like keys, uh, calcium are like keys. You use these keys to open different doors on cells to start and activate different things inside of a cell. And you'll be talking about calcium a whole lot in anatomy and physiology. So let's go back to the center. We're going back to bones, and we follow this line up, and we find out that there are different categories of bones. There's long bones, short bones, flat bones, irregular bones, sesamoid bones, sutural bones. Each one has an entirely different shape and pretty much an entirely different function too. Like long bones are longer than they are short. So an example of a long bone would be the humerus or a femur. You can also have long bones in your fingers and in your hands. Short bones are like the ones that are in your wrist, your carpals, and the bones in your ankle, which are your tarsals, because they're short and they're blocky. Flat bones are like your sternum. Believe it or not, it is like a flat bone. It looks like a piece of pita bread. Irregular bones are bones that are shaped like weird things, like animals. Like if you look at a sphenoid bone, it looks like a giant bat, or the ethmoid bone, it looks like a peach pit. Irregular bones just look really weird. They don't have a long or short shape to them. They're just really irregular. Sesamoid bones look like sesame seeds. The patella bone is like a sesamoid bone. Usually, a sesamoid bone is found wedged inside of some type of ligamentous or tendinous tissue. That's like the patella. The patella is attached to two different ligaments and it's sitting on your knee. Versus a sutural bone is found within a suture. And when they say suture, they're talking about a type of it's a type of joint that you find in your skull. It's where your skull bones fuse together, and there's like this little tiny bone that's in the crack, and that sometimes that bone hasn't fused into the rest of the bones yet, and so you have a little sutural bone still sitting there. If you take the long bone and you follow through the notes, you'll find that the long bone breaks down into several different components. There's an epiphysis, a diaphysis, and a metaphysis. The epi meaning end. Epiphysis is are the ends of a long bone. This is drawn like a Snoopy bone, right? So the end of the bone, end, epiphysis, diaphysis in between. So that's the shaft of the bone. And then the metaphysis, midpoint. The metaphysis is where the epiphysis and the diaphysis connect. It's where the dark bands are here. So that's the middle. That would be the metaphysis. If we come back to the middle again, we go back to skeletal system. We find out that there are bone cells, and there's four major bone cells that you find in your bone tissue: osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblast cells, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. If you haven't figured it out already, osteo, that word part, refers to bone. So these are bone cells, all four of them. And each one of these, underline, means something too. So progenitor means father. So that's the bone father. Luke, I am the bone father. Search your feelings, you know it's true. So osteoprogenitor, that's a bone father. So these are actually bone stem cells. And these other bone cells come from these osteoprogenitor cells. So you have osteoblast. Blast means to build. These are immature bone cells. So they're not mature, they're immature bone cells. That means that they can morph or they can evolve into another cell. That's when we say that they're immature. Blast also means to build. So anytime you see a cell with blast at the end of its name, that doesn't mean to destroy. That means in anatomy and physiology, that means it's building something. So osteo means bone, blast means build, bone building cell, right? So he works to build tissue, bone tissue. Osteo means bone. Cyte means cell or mature cell. So this is a mature bone cell. His job is actually to maintain, he does maintenance on bone tissue, right? He does maintenance on bone tissue. Clast, clast means to break. So bone breaking cell. And you might be like, wait a minute, bone breaking cell, why do I need him? Bone breaking cells, these guys help to dissolve bone matrix when you're either rebuilding and remodeling bone tissue or you're fixing, you're healing bone tissue. And that's when you'd want to break down bone tissue. If you had some fragments from some broken bone that you want to get rid of, or if you want to tear down old bone tissue and make new bone tissue. Keep following, go back to the skeletal system. We follow this arrow out. We've got compact versus spongy bone. Compact bone is much more dense than spongy bone. It's also heavier than spongy bone. So at first it's like, oh yeah, compact bone is better than spongy bone. But no, because if that joker is that heavy, then it's going to be very difficult for you to be able to move around. If your skull was completely compact bone, it would weigh as much as a large bowling ball. And so you would look like a walking bobblehead with a neck brace on all the time. So you can't do that. That's why your skull has spongy bone in the middle of all that compact bone so that it's strong like compact bone, but it's lightweight like spongy bone. And you can actually have your head on your neck without you looking like a West Coast hip hop video all the time. So yeah, so compact and spongy bone are really good friends to have mixed together. Now, we will follow this arrow here and we wind up seeing that we have the term ossification. Ossification is the process of making bone tissue, right? So we're making bone tissue through ossification, two different types, intramembranous and endochondral ossification. Intramembranous, intra meaning in between, and membranous talking about the substance that we're using to make the actual bone tissue from. So here with intramembranous, we are actually taking flat pieces of soft tissue and turning them into hard bone tissue, which is what you do when you make your skull bones. But endochondral, endo meaning inner, chondral is referring to cartilage. We are using cartilage to turn it into bone, and the cartilage that we're using is long cartilage, and we're starting from the inside out of that cartilage, henceforth the endo part. And so the inner portion of that cartilage, we take that and then we turn that cartilage into bone, and we use that to make a lot of your long bones, like your humerus and your femur and your tibia and your fibula and your ulna and your radius and the fingers and toes and everybody else goes. Remodeling, this is what you're doing in your body right now. Your body says, hey, this tissue is old. We need to remodel it so that we can get new bone tissue. So you start to break down the old and you replace it with new. And then we have fractures. Fractures, you can check your notes for that. Fractures are basically when we break a bone. I remember way back in the day when I was a kid, that fractures were referred to as something different from a broken bone. But nowadays, we refer to it all as the same thing. Fractures and broken bones, same deal. This is when we wind up destroying bone tissue. We make irregular breaks in the bone tissue, and there's all different types of fractures. We can talk about that in another discussion. There are numerous hormones to learn when it comes to the skeletal system. Something you need to understand about hormones, right? Hormones are chemical messages. They're not alive. Like hormones don't do. We say a hormone does something, but really the hormone itself is not doing it. The hormone is like a text message, and the receiver or the recipient of that text message then goes out and does an action. So these are text messages that are chemicals that are sent from one cell to another cell. So we have growth hormone, thyroid hormone, calcitonin, and parathyroid hormone. All four of these hormones, all four of these text messages will elicit a different response when they reach the target cells of your skeletal system. It's just like if you sent a random person a message that said, get the van, right? They would look at that message and they would be like, I don't know what you're talking about. But if you sent me that message and said that that would be, it would mean something totally different to me, right? So the same thing for growth hormone, thyroid hormone, calcitonin, and parathyroid hormone. Each of these hormones have a different response on the skeletal system versus another system. Growth hormone, you can imagine what growth hormone means. Growth hormone means to grow. So it's going to stimulate the cells to do things to cause bone tissue to grow. Versus thyroid hormone, that's going to have an entirely different response. Calcitonin tones down calcium levels in the blood. Parathyroid hormones picks calcium levels up. Because here's the thing, if you go back over here, you'll remember that I said one of the factors about bones is that they are a storage site for calcium and phosphate. Remember, storage for calcium and phosphate. And we need calcium and phosphate for a number of different things. Notice neither of these things are mentioning bone cells. They're mentioning all the other cells of your body. So we need that calcium and that phosphate to use somewhere else. So what happens is we store calcium and phosphate in the bone tissue to pull out and use when we need it. So if I need to reduce the amount of calcium in the bloodstream, because we don't need it at that moment, we deposit it into our bone bank using calcitonin. And then if we need to make a withdrawal of calcium out of the bones and into the blood, then we use parathyroid hormone to pick up the calcium levels that are there. Lastly, we have a little bit about cartilage. Cartilage is considered part of the skeletal system. Anytime you see the word part chondro, that's referring to cartilage. So keep that in mind. Anytime I see chondro, I start thinking cartilage. It's low on strength when you're comparing it to bones, but it's great on flexibility, which is why we use it. And we can have up to 3 different types of cartilage that we typically discuss in this class. We have hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is really tough. It's the most common type of cartilage we have, and we typically use it in between joints. And it's also what your fetal skeleton is made out of. You actually take the cartilage as a baby. We take the cartilage and what looks like our skeleton is actually made up of mostly hyaline cartilage at the time. So over time, that cartilage becomes bone, and it continues to grow and develop. Fibrocartilage is a type of cartilage that we use in places where we require a lot of strength due to a lot of pressure. So we have it in places like in between your knees, because your knees are constantly dealing with the pressure of walking and running and jogging and climbing stairs and all other kinds of things. We also have fibrocartilage as the discs that are in your back. So we refer to those intervertebral discs. When people say they had a slip disc, they're talking about the disc that was in between the vertebrae and their back. Those discs are made out of fibrocartilage, super powerful stuff that try to resist a lot of the pressure that's enlisted on them. And then elastic cartilage is one of the more rare types of cartilage because it's found in places like the ear and in your voice box, your larynx. It's found in places that are commonly known for requiring the ability to be able to stretch and be elastic, like, the articles of your ear and things like that. So hopefully that was a quick rundown. Try to keep it under 20 minutes to try to give you a better understanding of what's going on in the skeletal system. I'll continue to make these as we go over material. Deuces. Peace.